So I wanted to officially welcome everyone to the 2023 Ikeda Forum for Intercultural Dialogue. And today we are exploring the theme, Dialogues of the Heart, the role of literature in fostering inner transformation and peace. We have a very exciting and jam-packed agenda planned for everybody today. So we're just so excited to be in conversation with you all, and of course with our incredible panelists who came from all across the country and the world. So you'll get to meet them very shortly, so please hang tight. So to officially kick off our forum today, I would like to welcome our Executive Director, Kevin Maher, to share opening words.
Good afternoon. It is so joyful to see you all this afternoon, and thank you so much for joining the annual Ikeda Forum for Intercultural Dialogue, which also marks the Center's 30th anniversary. I can't think of a more meaningful way to commemorate this milestone in our history than with this distinguished panel of scholars and the many friends that have joined us today. On behalf of the entire staff, I want to express my sincerest appreciation to each of you for being here today and for your ongoing support of the Center. And 30 years ago this month, Daisaku Ikeda gave his second address at Harvard University titled Mahayana Buddhism in 21st Century Civilization, where he examined some key contributions that Buddhism can make toward the peaceful evolution of humanity. Our center was established on that same day as a tangible commitment to the spirit behind his talk. And in a message he sent to our opening ceremony, Mr. Ikeda writes that the objectives of the Boston Center go beyond the simple pursuit of knowledge. It was established within the context of a vaster human project to find out the ideas that can bring hope and happiness to people in the coming century, to seek roots to a world of peace and coexistence. He continues, it is no accident that this unique center has come into being here in New England. This is the land that gave life to Emerson, Thoreau, and Whitman, those great thinkers who gave us the brilliant currents of the American Renaissance. It is my profound hope and confident expectation that this center will carry forward the torch lit by these great predecessors and will share with the citizens of the coming century the warmth and light of a universal humanist philosophy. In the now 3 decades since the center's founding, we have organized forums, talks, scholarly seminars, and youth gatherings, all informed by Mr. Ikeda's dialogic approach to fostering cultures of peace. It has been our great fortune to have developed wonderful friendships along the way, and many of these friends are here with us this afternoon. Inspired by the example of our founder, we have striven energetically to practice open-hearted dialogue in all our programs and initiatives. And over the years, a number of staff, volunteers, and supporters have contributed greatly to the growth and development of this center, especially our founding executive director, Ginny Benson, who is here with us in the audience today. Thank you, Ginny. And I'm truly grateful for the staff who organized this event, starting with our program manager, Lillian Kozumi, who crafted and planned the poetic vision for this forum while balancing a wedding, amazingly. Alongside our incredible program team, Henri Tanabe and Priandra Noel. I also want to express my deep gratitude to my colleagues Beth Zimmerman, Mitch Bogan, and Bonnie Alexander for your dynamic and creative contributions to the center's programs and mission. And in addition, I want to welcome and appreciate our newest staff member, Jason Henriksen, who just started at the center this week. I think Jason is in the parking lot and the kitchen at the same time. So when we began discussing plans for the 30th anniversary earlier this year, we quickly realized that the perfect way to celebrate the significant moment would be to gather the contributors in the forthcoming book the center is developing in partnership with Dr. Anita Patterson, tentatively titled Dialogues of the Heart, Daisaku Ikeda, Transnationalism in American Literature. The themes covered in this book both resonate with the origins of this forum, as well as the mission of our center, which is to foster cultures of peace through learning and dialogue. We are greatly honored that several of the contributors to this forthcoming volume are part of our panel today, and we're looking forward to learning from each of you. Thank you so much. This has been a stimulating, hope-filled, and joyful experience planning this forum together closely with Dr. Patterson, as well as our panelists over the last few months with many dialogues of the heart. And today's panel includes cherished friends of the center, both new and long-term friends. Again, Dr. Anita Patterson, Sarah Wider, Jim Garrison, Kenneth Price, Jason Goulah, Ikea Johnson, Giulia Pellizzato, and Ashley Foster, who each embody the ideals that they teach and write about. So thank you all so much for being here. So, today's forum is the 19th event in what has become the signature series for our center. It was launched in 2004 and inspired by a series of dialogues between staff and Ronald Bosco and the late Joel Meyerson, two outstanding scholars of the American Renaissance. And throughout the forum's history, we have explored connections between life-affirming philosophies deriving from literary, cultural, and peace traditions in the East and West, and have partnered with many renowned scholars from diverse fields and disciplines exploring pathways to fostering peace. And we're grateful to each and every one of you for participating in the past forums. So as an exciting concluding point, I'm very pleased to share that we received a message, actually just yesterday, we received a message from Mr. Ikeda specifically for today's event.
So before we hear from our wonderful panelists today, we want to first warm up our own dialogue muscles, as we often do at the Ikeda Center with an icebreaker activity. So today's icebreaker activity, we're going to explore a question that actually our panelists have been giving some thought to, which is, when was the first time you were moved or impacted by a work of literature? So before we hear their responses in a little bit, we thought it would be great for all of us to take a few minutes to reflect on our own experiences with literature. So we have about 5 minutes for this activity. So you will be paired with either the person next to you, or in some cases, maybe the person in front of or behind you. And so please make sure there's enough time for each person in your pair to speak. So I'll call you all back in 5 minutes. So enjoy your dialogues. If we can slowly come back together in the room. Well, thank you so much. I can already feel the excitement and energy in the room, and I was thinking, wow, maybe book sales will go up today after this conference. People will be Googling, whatever you shared. So we'll also have more time for dialogue later, so please look forward to that. And so to continue our dialogues of the heart now, let's jump into our much-awaited panel discussions. And to introduce our panel a little bit more and what they will be exploring today, I would like to welcome to the stage our dear friend, Dr. Anita Patterson.
It's so great to see everyone today, and we're not even in the rain. Thanks to you all for attending this forum, and welcome. I'd like to say a few words about our theme, Dialogues at the Heart. What is the role of literature in fostering inner transformation and peace? In these chaotic and divisive times, there is a growing need to clarify the importance of the humanities as a resource to deepen intercultural understanding and to foster conflict resolution. With this goal in mind, today's panelists will share their insights and experiences in order to understand the immediacy and transformative power of literature, including its capacity to inspire heartfelt dialogue. In doing so, we should all keep in mind how Daisaku Ikeda's exemplary engagement with literature contributes to his global peace-building and human rights agenda, thus providing clear instances of literature's potential to advance the cause of greater human flourishing. Impelled by enduring wartime suffering as a child in Japan, Ikeda has dedicated his life's work to finding peace and eradicating the fundamental causes of human conflict. One of the most intriguing and edifying characteristics of Ikeda's work is his interweaving of serious literature into every aspect of his engagement, not only of those who look to him for guidance, but with the world at large, particularly other leaders in diverse spheres of activity and influence who share his interest in developing creative and non-dogmatic pathways to global peace. This engagement with literature appears throughout Ikeda's extensive corpus, in his poetry and serialized novels, in speeches and messages to Buddhist practitioners and students in the Soka Schools Network, in talks and addresses at universities and institutes, in 4 decades of annual peace proposals that blend aesthetic and philosophical reflection with concrete policy recommendations, in essays and opinion pieces in popular publications, and in dialogues with scholars and public intellectuals, more than 80 of which have been published as full-length books. In 2018, Ikeda remarked, "Growing up in Japan during World War II taught me all I will ever need to know about the suffocating realities of a militarism that will not brook free and open discussion. This experience instilled in me the conviction that dialogue is a bastion protecting human dignity against the assaults of violence, an essential force for the creation and expansion of peace." In a 1987 poem titled "Arise, the Sun of the Century," Ikeda recalls and celebrates what he has referred to as the irreplaceable nourishment he discovered in American literature. His early, formative, transnational encounter with American Renaissance authors, which initiated a lifetime of peace-building dialogue, is all the more significant when we consider that it occurred shortly after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II. He writes, "Since my youth years ago, Emerson and Whitman have been my constant companions. We have talked together, a dialogue of the heart." As a teacher and scholar who has studied Emerson's writings for decades, I have much to learn from Ikeda's reflections on Buddhist resonances in passages such as the opening of Emerson's 1836 book Nature, which Ikeda discusses in connection with the Buddhist concept of dependent origination. Nature expressed the oneness of nature and humanity in poetic terms, Ikeda observes. Emerson emphasized delight in interacting with nature. The Buddhist view of nature and the world is called dependent origination. This is the teaching that all phenomena are connected and none exist independently. True human happiness is born from expanding our awareness of this integration. Elsewhere, in his 1993 address at Harvard, Mahayana Buddhism and 21st Century Civilization, Ikeda compares Emerson's conception of the oversoul, of universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one, to the Buddhist idea of the greater self, fused with the universal life, through which cause and effect intertwine over the infinite reaches of space and time. I am drawn to Ikeda's dialogues of the heart with Emerson and others as a means of fostering peace and intercultural understanding, in part because of the experience of my own Japanese-American mother, Tomiko Ito, during World War II. In May 1943, she and her family boarded a bus and were evacuated to an internment camp in Poston, Arizona. During her internment, she was awarded a scholarship to spend her senior year at the Cambridge School in Western Massachusetts. Little did she know that she would go on to matriculate at Radcliffe College, where she would major in biology and graduate in 1949 and be just one of 7 women to enter Harvard Medical School the following fall. In a treasure trove of documents related to my mother's life, I discovered an essay she had written in 1944 about T.S. Eliot for a class at the Cambridge School. Eliot, who was influenced both by Buddhism and Emerson, is a poet I have cherished for decades. Like Ikeda's burgeoning friendship and dialogue of the heart with Emerson, my mother's reading of Eliot initiated a crucial, formative intercultural dialogue just months after her internment in Poston during a period of war and intense discrimination against Japanese Americans in the U.S. Thus, I was delighted to learn how, in his 1984 lecture on humanity and education, Ikeda praised Eliot's view that culture is living and that educators must broadly cultivate themselves so that they become truly international. Elsewhere, in a 2009 dialogue with Chingiz Aitmatov, Ikeda quotes from Eliot's Notes Towards the Definition of Culture to illustrate the connection between the Buddhist spirit of compassion and his own effort to develop and extend culture as a means of alleviating suffering and ensuring universal human rights. I hope you can see that Ikeda's reflections on American literature have inspired and vitally enhanced my own dialogues of the heart with Emerson and Eliot. But they have also done more than this, raising my awareness of Buddhist resonances in the philosophy and peace-building legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. In a series of groundbreaking conversations with the historian of social transformation Vincent Harding, published in 2013, Ikeda explored how King, who was influenced by Emerson, promulgated an ideal of beloved community that also affirms the Buddhist ideal of dependent origination. 4 years earlier, in another published dialogue with Harvey Cox, he commented that, quote, Buddhists identified the struggles of King with the attitude of a bodhisattva in the Lotus Sutra named Never Disparaging, who, although people ridiculed him and attacked him with sticks and stones, simply continued his nonviolent practice. Reading these and other passages by Ikeda has opened new possibilities in my encounter with King's writings. I recently discovered, for example, that in 1950, when he was a student at Crozier Theological Seminary, King wrote a research paper for a course on the history of living religions, exploring fundamental tenets of Mahayana Buddhism, where he expressed a view very similar to Ikeda's in comparing the attitude of the bodhisattva as an ethical ideal with Christian conceptions of vicarious suffering and transference of merit. Reflecting on the central purpose of our dialogues today, I am reminded of Ikeda's description of how dialogue has resonance with the art of jazz. These vibrant sessions, whether of jazz or dialogue, develop as participants give voice to the calls that issue freely from their lives, he writes, mutually respecting each other and bringing forth the best that each possesses. Dialogue is crucial for learning in the humanities, first and foremost because it fosters community. Reading responsively, we are never alone. Conversations about literature are free expression of admiration for, disagreement with, or elaboration on what someone else has said about a literary work, can spark precious moments of discovery and self-revelation, deepening our awareness of the realities and needs of others. I hope I have given some indication of how indebted I am to Daisaku Ikeda for his reflections on American authors whose works are central to his global peace-building and human rights agenda. He has strengthened my belief as a teacher that reading literature can foster dialogue both inside and outside the classroom, which will enable us to flourish despite the polarization and uncertainty of our current political moment. At this year's Ikeda Forum, I look forward to sharing experiences of how we all have, in different ways, been transformed by literature. Together, we will learn how the path called dialogue is also one that leads to hope, which Ikeda has described as the most important decision we can make. Thanks to Daisaku Ikeda, I now know that any dialogue of the heart involves a decision, first and foremost, to act by communicating through the medium of the spoken or written word as a crucial first step towards hope and the transformative experience of trustful peace building. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anita, for such moving words. And I think we are the ones that are indebted to you for all the wisdom and time you've shared with us. And so thank you so much. So now I'm thrilled to be able to welcome our first group of esteemed panelists to the stage, Doctors Ikeda Johnson, Jason Goulah, Ken Price, and Sarah Wider. Let's give them a round of applause.
Is this working? I think so. Yes, great. So I first would just like to welcome you all and thank you for being here, and also to just say a few words about each of our guests, panelists. So Ikeda Johnson is an assistant professor at the Department of English, Communications, and Media at Salve Regina University in Rhode Island. Welcome. Kenneth Price is Professor of American Literature and co-director of the Walt Whitman and Charles W. Chestnut Archives at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Welcome. Sarah Wider is a professor of English at Colgate University and former president of the Ralph Waldo Emerson Society. Welcome. And Jason Goulah is professor of bilingual bicultural education and director of the Institute for Daisaku Ikeda Studies at DePaul University in Chicago. Welcome to you all. So our first question is going to be one that all of our panelists will answer together. And I'll read the question aloud. What was the first piece of literature that impacted you in a significant way? How did your journey with literature begin? This is a wonderful question for people who study literature. So I wonder, Ikeda, would you like to go first?
For me, the first impactful piece of literature that I read was, I was about 12 years old, and it was Michael Foucault's History of Sex. My mother let me go to the library. Of course, at the time, I didn't know who Foucault was.
Wow.
But it was a transition from her reading to me, and then me reading to her, and then reading to myself. And it was just a book that really set me on my journey to realizing that I could get answers to questions from books, and that I can be in the library in a space that was safe and quiet. And then later on in high school, the book that really gave me the space to love literature was Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon. And I was just so moved by the way that she really held the human in the novel as a medium. And it was one of the first pieces of literature that I really connected with. So.
Thank you so much.
Trying to think what which book I should talk about. The autobiography of Benjamin Franklin was an important book early on. I've been drawn to self-made people, whether it's Benjamin Franklin or Frederick Douglass or others. I find those stories inspiring. Another book that moved me powerfully, I've stopped teaching it because of its use of the N-word, but Huckleberry Finn, because of its, just amazingly powerful denunciation of slavery, and its conflict between heart and conscience. And Huck is trapped by his culture's definitions and laws, and so whenever he thinks rationally, he concludes he has to give up Jim. He knows stealing is wrong, but he can't do it. He can't do the right thing to give up Jim, so he listens to his heart instead of his thinking self, and does what we as readers think is, of course, the right thing. So anyway, that was a powerful book for me.
For me, again, going way back, it was Winnie the Pooh. I was, and remain to this day, a shy person. And there was something about that world of that, was created in the 100-acre wood where, again, I felt safe. I felt like I had friends. And, the wonderful personalities of all those animals, continue to thrive in me today. And it was my mother also. She loved reading. She didn't have the chance to go to college, right? So she also just loved sharing stories, whether they were the ones that she read to myself and my sister, or whether they were the stories of all the people that she knew in this little town in Maine that I didn't even have a chance to visit until I was way grown up, And so it is really the thinking back through our mothers that always speaks to me. But it was so interesting in talking with you, Ikea, because when Ikea mentioned Song of Solomon, it was like, yes, that book. And it was given to me by a dear friend who's still my dear friend. Just saw her last week. And so these books that transform us, and the line that I still remember from Song of Solomon that I've held dear, all these years, I just wish I could have loved more people. And that's something to live by.
I wish I had some great story. I remember as a little kid in elementary school really being moved by this book, Super Duper Teddy. I don't know. I don't know if that book is even taught, but I was really into this little kid and his turtle. But then I didn't really like reading. I grew up really poor in a really drab, kind of underserved, socioeconomically underserved, kind of poor working class community. But I remember in high school, I think it may be 11th or 12th grade, taking AP English and reading Kafka's The Metamorphosis and just thinking, this is so different than anything else I had been forced to read. And then that really drove me to read everything I could find by Kafka. I really thought this world that he's creating is so different in the way it's speaking to the human being and the human condition and sort of self and other and the perception on the self. And for me, that was maybe the book.
Thank you all. I mean, it's really amazing to see how reading is a journey, and it's taken you all in such wonderful directions. The next question I'm going to ask, actually, I'll first ask Ken, but everyone else will have a kind of opportunity to sort of build and respond. It has to do with our theme. The phrase "dialogues of the heart" comes, as I mentioned, from a poem by Daisaku Ikeda. And what do dialogues of the heart mean to you, especially in these times of division and conflict?
I've spent a lot of time working on Walt Whitman, and one of the things that's powerful about Whitman, besides the poetry that he writes, is his dedication during the Civil War to healing people rather than advancing the killing. He went to the Virginia front when he heard that his brother had been wounded. He didn't know how badly wounded. It turned out it was a very superficial face wound. So since his brother didn't need his attention, he traveled with wounded soldiers back to Washington, D.C., and then relocated unexpectedly there and lived the rest of the war years and beyond in the Capitol, and ended up having a day job of just being a clerk, but every late afternoon and evening he would go to the hospitals and care for the wounded and the lonely and the ill and the people that were suffering amputations. And he would sometimes stay all night with these people. And he served white and black alike and North and South alike. And so his was a dialogue of the heart with these soldiers. And he was more medically effective than the doctors, because the doctors were operating with such primitive knowledge and with instruments that weren't cleaned, and infection was following and people were losing their lives. And so love was saving lives when medical interventions wasn't. So.
It's beautiful, thank you. And in fact, I think having experiences teaching Whitman's poetry to students, I've often actually had students come to me later experiencing various difficulties in their lives, and there's something about the intimacy of Whitman's address that people, I think, readers really find moving. Were there other people who'd like to sort of just comment on this phrase, dialogues of the heart? Yeah. Sarah, go for it.
I don't know if this is an answer, but when I started working with the Ikeda Center, it was explained to me as a place where people of great minds can speak from the heart. And I never forgot that. And thinking about literature, thinking about the sort of nature of dialogue, I mean, for Ikeda, you referenced it, Anita, dialogue is the master key for everything for him. Dialogue with literature, dialogue with art, dialogue with nature, dialogue with people, with history, civilizations. It is the way to be and become most fully human, which is his grand project. How do we continually grow in our own humanity and humanness? And I think literature for him is sort of the great expression of that, the written word across cultures. It's the way to manifest sort of ideas and culture. I think every time sort of I think through the lens of Ikeda's work, anytime I engage with literature, and I have to say, reading him has given me a real appreciation for literature, what I can get from literature. We were speaking yesterday, and Kevin was sharing, you know, reading literature in school is often reading it for some prescribed outcome that you should be finding rather than how does it speak to your own humanity. But reading Ikeda, thinking about literature is really what can I get from this about my own life, sort of to bring meaning, or in his words, create value from the tragedy of my own life or the trauma of my own life, the joys of my own life. So I don't think it's the work that matters. I think it's really the capacity to engage with it as what he would call an, you know, internalized other. How can you sort of weave that into your own story? Your own narrative grows, he would say, as you engage with the narratives of others. So.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And this idea of that a work of literature could be a kind of companionship when you're feeling incredibly alone is a wonderful resource, I think. Thank you.
I'm also always mindful of time, right? Yeah. But the fact of literature as some of our dearest companions, I mean, I think I've spoken to it already with Winnie the Pooh, but there also, I think, certainly for Mr. Ikeda, but for so many of us probably in this room, if you were fortunate enough not to be as, I think I heard in this room somebody who said it for the first time, they said poetry damaged, or just the way in which literature can get killed in school, and it just is heartbreaking. Yeah. But for me, so often, my dearest companions and friends have been the books, exactly, the ones I'm reading. You know, the people who are reading, the people who are always with me, and, you know, yeah, it's, thank heavens for these wonderful voices that speak across centuries and across places and across times.
I'm not going to go in order of the questions that we have, so to give everyone a chance. So this is, I guess, for Ikea and Ken. How can one undergo inner change through engaging with literature? And could you share an experience where you were transformed in some way by a piece of literature?
Sure. So the first time I read Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man in undergrad, I was studying Buddhism as a private and personal practice, and it became very clear to me while reading this novel that there were these transoceanic entanglements throughout the narrative. every step the protagonist took was parallel to the Eightfold Path, to the Four Noble Truths. And this initial encounter led me down a rabbit hole, right, of black, of black thinkers who purposefully engage with Buddhist thought in their literary, personal, and socio-political world. And so my spiritual practice was deepened as a result of just diving into that research. And I continue to do that for, more than a decade of just exploring how Buddhist ideology has been adapted and transformed into an African-American idiom. And I've specifically focused on, the transmission of Dharma, or wisdom, which has both these, ancient and contemporary rituals and lineages. So for me, it's just the book being the first means of engagement with that. Yeah.
That's great. And please, let me just mention that I discovered you through that article. And it's an incredible article. Ellison is just this amazingly important figure in bringing together these different sort of impulses in U.S. literature. And he writes on Emerson, he writes on Eliot, and his Invisible Man is really a fascinating exercise in that. But thank you. Ken.
Maybe we'll continue with the African American literature theme. A couple of writers that have been important to me include Frederick Douglass and Charles Chestnut, who's mentioned before. I guess all of us are teachers, and so I spend a lot of time thinking about learning, and always pleased when the students are motivated, but sometimes they're not. They're apathetic or, jaded or whatever. And, you read Frederick Douglass, and it's just so inspiring that somebody who's not only, deprived of education, but actively, forcefully discouraged from learning, and the resourcefulness, the will, the sheer genius of his ability to piece together how to read from the smallest strands of evidence, a letter on a piece of lumber that says S for starboard and, L for larboard, and then he's, bribing little white kids in the streets of Baltimore to show him, he would show them that he knew how to write, and so demonstrate the letters and ask them to beat that, and then he'd pick up a few more letters that way, and then build a knowledge world through these little pieces. It's inspiring to have somebody that dedicated to learning. And then with Chestnut, also an African American growing up in the Reconstruction era and not having access to quality education and being actively deprived of some things, and yet having the drive to teach himself French and German and Latin and Greek and shorthand. It's just astonishing how somebody could be so driven. So then I look at lazy students and I have less patience.
Thank you. Yes. So this is a question that I think I'll address to Jason first. And it has to do with Ikeda's definition of literature. And this is something, Sarah, I think this interests you as well. But how does Ikeda define literature? And also, how would you define literature? Are there good or bad works of literature, or literature that creates more value than others? And what are the most important characteristics of a work of literature that make it literary, in your view?
I am not qualified to answer that question at all. I keep saying I feel like a poser because I'm not in the world of literature or the literary. I really come to this as an Ikeda scholar. I can maybe defer the second question to everybody else. I maybe just from my own perspective, I treat literature as that which just resonates with me. I like reading it. If I don't like reading it, I put it away. I feel good that it's maybe on my bookshelf. If someone sees it, hey, he's smart, he's got that book. But the ones that I read are the ones that really just resonate. I don't know why they resonate, they just do. That's what I treat as literature. And I try to glean from fiction and nonfiction alike what resonates with me. In reading Ikeda, it's quite interesting. I mean, he's a Buddhist thinker, Buddhist philosopher. I think that's his, first and foremost, that's his worldview. I think we can all agree on that. But interesting, and he mentions it in the message that he sent for today. When he was a young person studying under someone named Josei Toda, Toda had this group for young people to foster them in their development, and the curriculum was literature. It was not Buddhist teachings. It was not doctrinal teachings. It was literature, sort of the classics. And I think Ikeda really grew from that, and he reads and read a lot of things from the Japanese canon, but also things from the kind of Western canon. And I think as he gets older, he engages more and more with works from around the world. And what's amazing to me, this is a little bit different from the question, but his capacity to see the historical text and the modern text in dialogue. So in a dialogue or in an essay or something, he'll bring, for example, Goethe into conversation with Aitmatov, into conversation with Whitman, into conversation with Emerson. They're all there, and from Ikeda's perspective, it makes sense, total sense, to help us sort of unpack the human condition, to understand sort of the possibilities for joy even in the midst of the most pressing challenges. And so I don't know how he exactly defines literature, but I think he strives to understand deep cultural expression in great and timeless works of art. I think if we recognize the works that he's constantly referencing, it's what we might consider timeless works rather than sort of modern manga or the anime kind of stuff. I think he's really interested in these great works of the human condition that stand the test of time.
Thank you, Jay. And I think as well that we see him expanding the kind of the definition of literature insofar as he also, there's a commentary on Martin Luther King and Langston Hughes drawing from the title of Hughes's poem. So I think there's a kind of expansive ideal of literature here too. Are there other? Yeah, Sarah.
Yeah, I'll go ahead, because when I first saw the question, because of course we had a chance to preview the questions, I just had to say I resist defining literature, because precisely because those who often have defined it in exclusive terms, like this is excellent literature. I'm sorry, that's probably not nice of me to say that way, but and this isn't, and of course, going through a schooling system, and especially in graduate school, boy, did I get a lot of that. And as I was thinking about this, I have always loved the power of the word. Originally, nobody wrote. We all spoke. And I have dear friends at the Pueblos in New Mexico, and I remember this one wonderful friend who's actually been here at the center for one of the forum, talking about how really it is in the spoken word where there's really breath behind it, that it's relational and we're talking with each other. And he told a story on himself where at one point he just wanted to get the information from a book because it would have been so quick. But he knew he had to go to his dad. And his dad, took his time, sat Joe down to say, hey, how's your day? And so it became a whole expansive conversation. And of course, Joe was in that mindset of, I've got to get to class, I got to get this, I got to do that. And his father completely reframed that for him, saying, no, what we have to do is be together. And if you want to understand something that you need to know, we have to take the time with each other. And I think that connects in with, Mr. Ikeda, that whenever I have read any works by him, whether it's poetry, whether it's essays, he always builds in time. It's time for every one of us. There's time for all time. And there's also this sense, again, of this large conversation, like you were saying, Jay. And that, too, was so refreshing to me because, again, boy, you kind of got your metaphorical hands slapped in graduate school if you try to make those connections, like, oh, that wasn't scholarly, oh, that wasn't, rigorous or analytical enough. And I was so delighted and relieved to find, no, really to take that, I guess what I would call non-scholarly approach, so that it is interconnective, and again, kind of goes back to the dialogues of the heart that we can all have with each other, definitely, and through books, obviously, too.
Do people in literature like to define literature? Is this like something they do or no?
I think it's always, right, I think it's always implied. There were times when there was such a kind of rigid restriction of what was called the canon, and you weren't even allowed to talk about the life of the poet. I mean, that's just, in thinking about the emergence of literary criticism, that was a long time ago, but I think it's important to have an expansive definition of literature, because there's so much that we'll lose if you don't do that, I think.
I think for Ikeda, it's not something that exists in the academic world solely. So I think for him, it's for everybody. It's a great way to kind of obliterate hierarchies and boundaries. So I think he would, if I had to guess, maybe sort of resist, sort of.
Ikea, would you like to add to this?
Sure. There are certain authors like Ralph Ellison, like Toni Morrison, like Alice Walker, who take insights from the times that they were writing, from the 60s, from the 70s, right? And they turn it into a political purpose, a socio-political purpose, where they're interested in literature as opposed to why wouldn't they be a sociologist, right? And for them, because the novel as a medium, they like to imagine it as something that, again, I say can hold the human, right? Can hold us in a narrative, and they have such a strong desire for justice. So, I'm sure there are thousands of reasons why they chose literature, but instead of going into like an autobiographical biography, the psychology of the author, we can look at the novel and, what happens when you can touch another human through the novel as a medium. And so for me, literature is something that can hold me, right? And it can hold others. And when we're held together, it also allows voices to speak that may not have had a voice to speak otherwise. And they have a story that we can glean from the literature in ways that we may not be able to get, that your traditional academics may not be able to give us, such as a sociologist or a psychologist or a politician. And so, literature for me is the opportunity to enter into a world and to be transformed by it. It's about a life that's closer to the author's moment, that moment when they are writing. And that's how I try to look at literature, as I teach it and think about it and read it.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. It reminds me of the fact that literature is a way into a historical moment for me. I mean, it's sort of the first step. Ken?
Sure. I was thinking about a definition I once heard, that literature is news that stays news. And that kind of works. But we do also need to be careful about, thinking about the canon that's been mentioned, because it can be a chancy thing. And so some writers who it might seem like they are so important, so famous, somebody like Melville was almost totally forgotten, or Kate Chopin was almost totally forgotten, or many African-American writers. And so the custodians of memory are shaped by social forces, and they haven't always been, surveying the entire spectrum of life in a society, put it that way. So, we have to be very scrupulous about how we think about assessing current writing and what's saved and what's fostered and passed on into the future.
Thank you. I think it's important to think about our political moment in light of this, and the job that universities have for not censoring and banning books. Yes. Yeah, thank you. The next question, again, is open to everyone, but I'll, I guess, address it to Sarah. There may be folks in this room who had a negative experience with literature or just feel there is no time in their lives for literature. What would you say to them?
You've already heard me speak to this a little bit. And I think first of all, for any of you who have been, whether you just got so discouraged in school or maybe by friends or maybe by even family members, who knows, in the way that you read. I mean, every way of reading is a way of reading. And, Emerson was famous for talking about creative reading. He also talked about reading for the lusters. It's like you read and you go, oh, this phrase or this sentence. And it didn't have to be created into some sort of a thesis, or it didn't have to fit into somebody else's category. It's just like, for that moment, that was lustrous to you. It illuminated something. And I love that, and I want everybody to feel that because of the wonderful vibrancy of so many words, not maybe all words, but so many words. And so, I guess partly because I've been part of a profession that has done a lot of the damaging, I kind of want to go like, I am really sorry if you were damaged in your education, because that should not have happened. We should be all loving those resonances that, Jason talked about a little while ago with how President Ikeda understands the literature and the things and how we all connect to what we have. And so it's just like read what speaks to you or listen for those words that really hold your heart, hold your humanity, hold each other. And heaven knows in this time, that's so much what we need. At the beginning of the pandemic, I started posting a poem online for every day, just so that people could have some words to hold on to. Sometimes they were the heartbreaking words, sometimes they were encouraging words. And it just felt like, again, poetry not in the rind and did I get it right? My poor mom used to say that she was horrible at poetry because she couldn't write a sonnet. And she was afraid that she was going to poetry damage me because she didn't like poetry, my own mother. It's like, Mom, I'm so sorry that you felt that way. And so I think for me, poetry and the beauty of the word and the fact that we share these words. I've also had just a tiny bit of experience traveling, not nearly in ways enough. But bless the translators. Bless people who make it possible for us to talk. And when I've been in Japan a few times, it has just been marvelous because it feels like we're all just working with a language that we have to share our hearts with each other. And that for me is what literature really is supposed to be.
That's beautiful. And it's also, it's a reminder that poems can be really, really short. And you can read them and not have any idea what they're about. And then suddenly the words come back to you in different contexts. And so in that sense, I don't think you need a lot of time necessarily for exposure. And I mean, it's interesting, soldiers were writing haiku poems in the trenches during World War I to help process their trauma. So I think, just really understanding the kind of the immediacy is a great thing.
And can I just add one more thing, because I love what I'm wearing today. Some of you have already heard the story, but I'm wearing a poem because my son made me this shirt. And yes, you can come up close, you can take a look at it. It has chickadees, it has birch trees, and so it's that homage to nature, it's that understanding that we are only fully human if we are fully connected with the natural world. And then also, I will not demonstrate because that would be embarrassing, but when my son makes me shirts, they always include a poem. And so there's a little poem, which is a very short poem by Emerson that's about a chickadee that's written into my shirt tails, but again, I'm not gonna whip it out for you to see. But the phrase that I love from this Emerson poem is, "Oh, tufted entomologist." He describes the chickadee as, who knows the chickadee knows his insects, and he's got that lovely little tuft. So. It's wonderful. Who else here would like to respond to this question? What would you say to a student who said they don't have enough time? Ken?
Well, I think that literature gives us an opportunity to engage in imaginative reasoning and to imagine different social constructions. And, if you are at all dissatisfied with any aspect of the world we live in, then, why not go to literature? Because it can take you to a space where you can think about other ways things could be organized. And so it seems.
And if you think about the historical development of U.S. literature and the importance, for example, of W.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, where he was kind of introducing himself to many people who wouldn't have ever met someone, a black man, before. It's really important. Thank you. Ikea?
What would I say to a student who says they don't have time? Life happens, and I think it's important to give students the space and opportunity to understand that they can use literature to synthesize the things that happen in their life, to transcend the boundaries of time and space and see the ways that they can show up differently when they feel like they don't have time, or to connect to a character that may have been running out of time in some way, and what that looks like for them, what that looks like as they construct their essays, what that looks like as they think about narrative and what it is to be human and how to show up anyway, right? So I think that's it.
Thank you. And especially when we think about the fact that our lives are so informed by text now, this is a really different way of experiencing text that's not, sort of instrumental. I think we have time for one more question. Okay. I'm going to have to... This makes it hard. Yes, Jay.
I wonder if we can talk a little bit about the poetic spirit.
Yes. Why don't we talk about the poetic spirit? Let's do this one.
It's such a core idea for Ikeda that I think it sort of animates how we engage with literature, but the world.
That's great. I'll just read the question and then we'll jump in. Yeah. Ikeda writes, "The eyes of a poet discover in each person a unique and irreplaceable humanity, while arrogant intellect seeks to control and manipulate the world. The poetic spirit bows with reverence before its mysteries." What is this poetic spirit that Ikeda talks about?
So I teach a course on this, and students really love this concept from him. And initially they think he means writing poetry, that it's the word on the page is the poetic spirit, and it's not that. He introduces this concept, many of you may know more than I, but he introduces this concept relative to Blaise Pascal's idea of the geometric and the sensitive notion of the mind. And the geometric is the sort of rational side of the mind, and the sensitive is the space of intuition and this kind of thing. And he says that the latter there's not enough focus on that. And he says, I call this part the poetic mind. And then I think it's worth reading, just because I think this underpins kind of the way, almost to what Ikea was talking about, this transformative power of literature. It's no question that the title of his 30-volume novelized account, and before that 12-volume novel, is The Human Revolution, and then The New Human Revolution, this inner transformational power. But he says, the gaze of the poet is directed at the heart, at the mind. He does not see even things as mere matter. He converses with the trees and the grasses, talks to the stars, greets the sun, and feels a kinship with all that is around him.
In all these things, he sees life and he breathes life into them, seeing in the myriad changing phenomena of this world the unchanging principle of the universe. And the poet is free of the fetters imposed by institutions and ideologies. He perceives the unlimited potential of the individual that transcends the trappings of society. He recognizes the bond that links all humankind in intricacies of the invisible web of life. I call the wellspring of this prolific spirit the poetic mind. The poetic mind is the source of human imagination and creativity. It imparts hope to our life on this earth, gives us dreams, and infuses us with courage. It makes possible the harmony and unity and gives us the power no army can vanquish to transform our inner world from utter desolation to richness and creativity. And I think if we can read with that kind of spirit, if we can engage literature in that kind of way, it just makes everything pregnant with possibility. And I think that's what he's sort of taking from literature.
Thank you so much. And the fact that you talk about in that passage, the poetic heart, mind, it also sort of speaks volumes, I think.
These come from the Japanese word kokoro, which heart and mind is one. They're not two separate things in the Japanese discourse.
One more response here? Yeah. Anyone else on them?
I just want to say what Jay said. But, yes, the poetic spirit is that which connects us all. A writer I've been finding also very generative in preparing for today is Adrienne Rich. And also she is just one of these people, like Ikeda, who wants to bring all of the voices together. And she talks about, thinking of the way in which poetry, the poetic spirit, I guess as we would be calling it, is that connective force among us all, and how that it is that which transforms. And of course, going back to the way we get the word poetry from a Greek word that means to make or to do. And so I've always loved that, which really I was led to thinking about the poetic spirit is it's that which animates. And also, I guess, if those of you have not read Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, it is a wonderful book. But I'm just thinking now of her phrase, the grammar of animacy, that everything has its own language and is alive and speaking to us, just as President Ikeda talks about, the poetic spirit, the poetic heart mind is in conversation with the trees, with the stars, with all of being.
Thank you so much. I think we can open it up to questions from you guys.
Great.
Audience.
So can we give our wonderful panelists another round of applause? As someone who really struggled with literature, I was just thinking the whole time, I wish they were my professors in college, but I'll have to go reapply to school again at all of your universities. And Sarah, I think we all need a shirt from Tayward, so we're gonna have to talk to. So we have about maybe 10 minutes for Q&A, and so I think that would be about 2 questions. So if you have a question, if you can raise your hand, either myself or Jason in the back will head towards you. So maybe Anna first, if that's okay.
Thank you so much, Lillian. Sarah, you mentioned a phrase that I really like. You said, we are only human if we are fully committed to the natural world. And my question is, how to use literature in front of the climate change and in front of all the uncertainties we're facing today. And that phrase really resonates with me, and I would like to know from you and from any of the speakers, how we can use and how can we actually promote literature to help with that.
Oh, that's a wonderful question, and something that, yes, and again, yes, and again, yes, because I think about, and also Giulia will have a whole lot more to say about this in the next panel, so yay, Giulia. The sense that we articulate the worlds for ourselves, but we have to really listen. And this is a phrase, again, you just heard from Jay, from President Ikeda. It's a phrase that I first encountered from Emerson, where he talked about conversations with nature. And one of the things that I love about the way that he elaborates on that is he says, you know, with human beings, if you're going to be in conversation with nature, you have to shut your mouth. You have to listen. And so I certainly with, I'm going to cry because I'm emerita now, so I'm not teaching and I miss my students. But what I loved is being able to take them outside. Whatever we were reading, I taught a lot of contemporary Native American literature and saw writings from people who had seen how environmentally damaged their lands had become because of, say, the uranium mining in New Mexico, where I'm from. And being able to get my students outside so that we could actually literally ground ourselves. There was one time where I was teaching actually a Wangari Maathai, and I just asked the students at the very beginning of the semester, before we'd even read anything, to say, go find a tree on campus and keep a tree journal. Just keep revisiting that tree again and again and again. And they were like, how? What? I said, no, trust me. And it was wonderful. I kept many of them. I could not bear apart with these tree journals because, again, they'd been transformative. So I'm always a big fan of, let's have class outside today. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We'll have to take the forum outside next year. So maybe I have a question over here. That's okay. Thank you, Jay.
Yes, I don't know. But I was wondering about the role, particularly in Ikeda's thinking, of orality, right? When we are discussing literature, right, we're often privileging the written word, right? And that particularly privileges the kind of Euro-American understanding of what thinking and literature is, when there are many cultures for whom orality is a form of literature. So I'm wondering if any of the panelists can speak to the place of orality in Ikeda's thinking.
I feel like I'm talking too much, but I'll just say something very quickly because this was a wonderful understanding that I would not have learned had I not been able to have the opportunity to talk with people who, you know, when President Ikeda creates a poem, it's orality, you know. And so, and people talked about how they would then transcribe it, write it down, right? But it is fundamentally oral. And of course, you know, I think about that, you know, for all of the literature that I have devoted so much of my life to, whether, you know, especially the indigenous writers, you know, it's like this is where language is at. You know, this is what breathes us and what we breathe into being. And so I won't say anymore, but let's talk afterwards too. I'd love to talk more.
I don't know about literature in the sense that we're kind of thinking about it here, but one of the core texts for him to illuminate sort of great poetic work, the Lotus Sutra, is the Ongikuden, the orally transmitted teachings. And I think this is, you see him constantly referencing this and the power of the orally transmitted teachings informing how he engages with literature and everything else that he's sort of his spheres of influence are touching. But I haven't seen, it's probably somewhere, but I haven't seen him sort of speak to oral cultures and what we can grasp from them. But knowing him, I would think he would really identify the unique treasure of that cultural expression, rather than saying, that's not literature. You know, I can't imagine him moving in that direction. It's the other direction.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And then there's the sheer fact of the published dialogue, the fact that, you know, the genre of dialogue, spoken conversation, this really forms the basis for his oeuvre. It's great.
So we actually have time for one more question, if there is one. If not, Gonzalez. Oh, perfect.
It's good to see all of you, and thank you for this wonderful panel. I was talking to a teenager the other day, and she said to me that she doesn't read all her knowledge she gets from TikTok. And, you know, and I resonate with worries about the canon and what counts as real literature or not, but I also worry about that comment from a student. So there is a difference between kinds of ways of communicating. I don't know, that's not my point. But I was thinking of my experience as a student and reading, for example, Emerson. And I thought, first encounter, without much help from teachers or anything, and I had the sense, this writer is part of my world. Maybe it's on the other end of the room, but it's part of my world. And I couldn't feel that with Shakespeare or Milton or Quevedo. They start speaking from another world. It would require a lot of education on my part to converse with these writers. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on the experiences of young people of a world mediated by technology, whether the sense of belonging to a different world than many of these great voices, if you have any thoughts on that, whether their experiences are different than ours.
That is a good question. I think it's important to try to tie in their experiences with what we would consider perhaps a version of digital humanities, right? And how we can harness their interaction with social media and the digital humanities to foster a safe space within the classroom, this third space, right, where we can bring social media into the classroom, or we can use social media as a medium for them to communicate with a larger audience, how they construct their projects, right, or how they construct their essays. And I think it's important to identify in a historical moment how certain writers may have been marginalized for where they were in terms of space and place, and then to look at where we are in space and place and how we can harness those spaces to be agents and tools of change, of communication, and of dialogues of the heart, right? Yeah.
I think, just thinking about Ikeda, I have a feeling he would embrace TikTok for its capacity to engage in a form of dialogue. So I think he would love it, but I think he would also, and maybe practicing his dance moves or whatever for his TikTok, I'm joking. But I think he would also encourage what is underpinning your engagement in that kind of dialogue. And so I think it's not to one or the other, but I think the one has to also be shaped by the other in a sense. But I'm also thinking of there was someone who wrote a novel, I think, on Twitter, right? So within that word limit, sort of every day was posting sort of a novel, right? Sort of within that new structured form, being able to express the same mode that they do. But I think there is something about digital media that is shaping the young person's mind differently than the way maybe my mind was shaped by literature. It's just a different experience, but I think it is important to make them conscious of it and not to forget that there is this whole other world that has shaped where the world doesn't start with them just now because they're doing TikTok, but there was a whole world beforehand rich with expression that they should also engage, and how they engage it, I don't know, but that's what I would encourage them.
Thank you. Let's thank our panelists. This is so great.
Without further delay, I'd like to welcome our second panel to the stage, Drs. Ashley Foster, Jim Garrison, and Giulia Pellizzato.
This is wonderful, and I think I'll start just by introducing our new panelists. So Giulia, I'll begin with you. Giulia Pellizzato is conducting research at Harvard as a postdoctoral fellow. of the project Transatlantic Transfers, the Italian Presence in Post-War America, funded by the Italian Ministry of Education, University, and Research. And Jim Garrison is Professor of Education in the School of Education in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Virginia Tech University and former president of the John Dewey Society. And Ashley Foster is Assistant Professor of 20th and 21st Century British Literature in the Department of English at California State University, Fresno. That's great. Welcome. So we're going to have this wonderful exchange now where everyone is going to answer the same question. What was the first piece of literature that impacted you in a significant way, and how did your journey with literature begin? Giulia.
I was really trying to go for that seat. But I was not decided enough, so I have the pleasure to kickstart our conversation. When I heard this question, I immediately thought about a book that I really loved when I was in kindergarten. And then as the first panel was talking, I was like, oh, kindergarten, this means I wasn't able to read. And this book is by Leo Lionni, who is considered a pioneer of children's books. It's titled Swimmy, and it's about a little fish that is a little different. It's a black fish in a school of red fish. One day, all the red fish disappear, probably eaten. And he finds belonging by traveling the sea, and one day finds a new community, and through his ingenuity and his difference, he helps this group of fish oppose the bigger fish. Yes, I love this book so much that I was gifted it by my teachers, and then I completely forgot about it and find it in a library, no, in a bookshop, when I was a PhD student, and I was really questioning my path in literary studies. And as I reread this book, I realized there's everything in here. The sense of estrangement, the way of finding new sense of belonging, and the use of one's difference for benefiting the community. And so I feel this, we were discussing with Jim and also with Ashley, are we shaped by these books that we love, or is it us that find them somehow? I don't really know how to respond, but for me it was really interesting to find this book again.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Thank you so much.
Oof. Is this the part where I have to say something clever or intelligent?
No.
It's funny. Yeah, for years, many years, probably half of my career, I used to always arrive in classrooms early, and if there's any new teachers out there, prospective teachers, this trick works. Be sure that you get to the class before the students do, and watch them file in, and remember who smiles at you, because those will be the faces that you'll look at, and instead of being overwhelmed by the masses of faces in the audience. For me, this one was a quick one. I knew exactly what the text is, although again, in our conversation, there could be so many others at different stages of life. But the first book that really walled to me, I remember well. Now, here's what's interesting about it. I cannot tell you the name of the author. I cannot tell you the title of the book, nor can I name any of the characters in the book. But it was on friendship, which is a certain own kind of intimacy. I'm a philosopher, a philosophia, a friend of wisdom. I'm his buddy, but I ain't got a whole lot of it myself. And friendship looms so large in the work of Ikeda. And that came later as I started, after I would tell the story I'll tell you in a moment. But right, there's a certain intimacy there, a certain co-constitution of yourself in your relation to the other, a certain caring for each other. I've shared the stage with Noel Noddings the late Noel Noddings many years ago, who wrote a wonderful book on caring, and with implications for the caring professions, counseling, nursing, teaching, that sort of thing. Of the 6 boyhood friends that I held on throughout my life, 4 of them are now deceased. And this was a book about friendship that persisted across a lifetime. That part I remember, in tears, actually. That part I remember. Checked it out in 3rd grade, 3rd grade library, which I was old enough to read. And I kept it for as long as I could. And I'm a repetitive reader. I read again and again and again. Returned it to the library, and I remember very well later in the 3rd grade, I checked it. I checked it out again. So there you have it, right? This is a book that I've carried with me since the 3rd grade, and I've now laid a nameless text in front of you, having carried it into the room today, in gratitude to a nameless author.
Is this one on? It is. Well, and one of the things that our conversation, our ongoing dialogue has brought up is that there's so many ways of having different influences with texts, and what does a first impact mean, and in what way is that first impact? And so one of my first impacts would be, as a baby, my dad has a really deep baritone, and he'd hold me really tight and read Tiger, Tiger to me and all of the William Blake poems. And so my memory of poetry is being pressed against his heart in a deep somatic experience where I could feel his vibrations like infuse the poem in me almost. But I obviously couldn't read. In fact, I'm kind of amazed I can even remember it, but I can feel it more than I can remember it. And then on an intellectual level, the piece of text that made me want to become a modernist was a reading. It wasn't reading, actually. It was reading with others, Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. And it was the Auerbach reading of To the Lighthouse, and it was my professor. I was a sophomore in college, and I had read the signed reading. Okay, that's fine, and it didn't really call to me. But then what this Professor Eva Badowska outlined was one of the most famous analyses of To the Lighthouse, and I was 19 when I heard it, but I can still remember the lecture today because it was so impactful, about Mrs. Ramsay and her reddish-brown stocking. And of course, this is a famous reading that she had borrowed critically, and how the space and time of the action and the plot was in the knitting of the brown stocking. And so in the most literal way, the only thing happening is the knitting of the brown stocking, and that's it. But there are all of these pages and pages of Mrs. Ramsay thinking, and then thinking about the housemaid, and then thinking about the housemaid who has a father in Scandinavia in the mountains who may or may not be dying of cancer, and then what does this mean about the temporality of life, and all of these various elements. So the mind travels and wanders, and it's this wonderful modernist moment of interiorization and the movement from exterior plot into inner space and time. And that idea was so captivating, just what you could do with literature, how she could make a story out of it, that I fell in love with Virginia Woolf at that moment. And indeed, I'm still working on Virginia Woolf today. So that was another first that kind of spoke to me.
Thank you so much. This is really illuminating to hear how these origin stories for people's journeys. This is a question, actually, that we haven't raised yet, that was part of the list of questions. In what ways can literature foster a culture of peace? In these increasingly divisive times, how can literature be a tool for realizing peace? We can start with Giulia. Yeah.
Why not? Well, if I may, I'll share about my graduate studies dissertation that was about the system of characters in a now classical novel from Italy, Ippolito Nievo's Confessions of an Italian. And my interest was really into how this fellow managed to transform me through his book. And I would be looking at how the structuring of characters would give me an understanding that change is possible. So somehow, where I arrived at some point was, by portraying how these characters are transformed by experience, and I'm experiencing vicariously things with them, this is transforming my life, and I see them transformed by their experience. And by identifying with people I would never be, different characters of different genders, of different social background, this really brings me to empathize with others in a way that I wouldn't do otherwise. So maybe one first little stone for our collective construction could be this element of experiencing through the eyes or feelings of someone else.
No, it's quite a question. I think any expressive art, expressive meanings as opposed to propositional meanings, it's probably your most unrestrained mode of communication. I was talking to Mitch earlier. He does dance amongst other things. There's the places over the Greek where they just start dancing their stories. If you've ever read that, and so even in translation, I think any art, including literature, is an extraordinary mode of communication. You've already introduced the word empathy. I would follow that along with the vicarious experience literature can give you, particularly when you're young and haven't seen the consequences of the life you're sort of living, or don't live the sort of life that you could encounter in literature, right? From whatever walks of life they could be, or people enculturated in dramatically different ways that are different than you. And for an embodied philosopher like myself, those are embodied habits that are quite different than your embodied habits. And so you can experience different people in different places, vicariously, and get a sense of them that builds, a sympathy, or an empathy. And for me, at least in particular, I see all literature as a three-term relation. There's a danger to see, literature in particular as information that's somehow supposed to be downloaded, into your little brain by some great literati, somewhere. I'm trying to get a certain Walt Whitman mocking voice in me right, his education ended at the age of 11, forget the 11th grade, right? His education ended, but he had a library card. I see it as a three-term relation, right? Influenced in part by the late Louise Rosenblatt. In her book, The Reader, the Text, and the Poem, where the poem, the meaning emerges in between. So when you encounter literature, that third term, the poem, the creative work that you as the reader can do with a literary text, as long as you don't just stomp over it and turn it into you in some sort of ways, is at least part of the power of literary text or any other work of art, as a three-term, not a two-term, creative relation between the reader and the text.
I love that distinction between propositional and expressive. That really gets at something for me. Ashley.
Well, thank you for asking this question. I really love this question. It is possibly the work of my life, this particular question. So it's too large. I'll only pull a couple of threads. It's way too big. But I would start by saying that Ikeda says, in times of crisis, it's the poet's role to sound the alarm and awaken the people. And he writes that in The Art of True Relations. And so there's a way in which poetry can initiate peacemaking processes by sounding the alarm. Although I also notice that the question says, what ways can literature foster a culture of peace? And one of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of Ikeda is the way that poetry is infused in literature, that is part of what makes literature. Literature is this poetic spirit that the last panel was talking about, and that this poetic spirit is infused with the peacemaking process. And that what poetry can do is to attune our imaginations and to make us the kinds of people that create peace. It can open worlds and possibilities. It gives us the imagination of peace, a vision of what might be an alternative to what is. It opens what could be. It provides possibly new knowledges, new epistemologies, ways of being in the world too. So Ikeda also says there is a power in words, an infinite power to revive, restore, and to make life blaze anew. And I think that this reference to the blaze is really important. He's got images of light that infuse both his poetry and his philosophy. And these images of light speak back to a notion of interconnectedness. And I think that what poetry can do is remind us of our interconnectedness and make these relations apparent. Poetry for Ikeda is the marriage of the inner cosmos with the outer cosmos. And this relationship is a dialogue also between the self and the universal, a dance in some formulations. And so I think that poetry can allow us to dance with each other and with the universe metaphysically.
Thank you so much. Actually, this idea of the poetic spirit, I just want to see if Jim or Giulia would like to say more about this.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to have to front load it a little bit. I'll approach it through literary text in a certain sense. For any work of art, but for a literary text, you use the phrase, not the life of the universe, but the universal. The writer creates a text. It's a part of their lives, and it operates as like a karmic seed. And if you don't like that, then conditions and consequences in the pragmatic tradition. It's an actual thing that has indeterminate potential and unforeseen and unforeseeable consequences. And it's awakened again in any reader that reads that text. Once again, it's the three-term relation. Of course, for me, Walt Whitman, of all people, incredibly invites us. He says things, I may get the quote wrong, but I put my hand upon you that you shall be the poem. In his case, he knows that you are the poetic collaborator, but any other author should also know it too, because the reader of the text is the one that's going to recreate the text. In the case of Ikeda's appreciation for Whitman, what I like is that this is a dialogue of the spirit, if you would, a creative, that's the poetic spirit, a creative dialogue of the spirit between someone in the death phase of the greater self, Walt Whitman, and someone that is now very late in the life phase, Daisaku Ikeda. This doesn't completely capture it, but I think it illuminates an important part of it, is that whether it's conditions or consequences or actualities, like a literary text that has indeterminate potential to be actualized by readers across perhaps thousands of years. I'm, for instance, am tremendously influenced by the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a very ancient text. That's at least part of the poetic spirit, and part of the dialogues of the heart is that incredible co-creative, co-constituting, codependent relationship in the creation of meaning, perhaps over eons. Now, that's plenty, and there's much more to it than that. I'll let it go there.
It's fantastic to think about the humanities as a resource. I want you to, spread the word. Giulia.
Thank you. It's hard to continue after what Jean said, but I feel from my perspective, one of the ways in which I'm reading Ikeda's work is by observing what role do literature and nature have in his vision, especially in the field of education. And interestingly, literature and nature, or we could say also culture and nature, meet or become one when we tune into our poetic spirit. Because if we read what Ikeda writes, like each one of us is potentially a poet, so we just need to find our own way back into that. And a lot of his poetic production is written with the intention of helping people reading tune into their poetic spirit and find their own path for expressing their own poetic heart or mind. So this means that it's connected with action as well, and it connects our body and mind and emotions at the same time. And so I find there's almost a cosmic dimension to our own poetic heart or mind, which I find fascinating.
Thank you. And that also reminds me of Emerson's The Poet, where he identifies us as poets, and just thinking about how action is poetry and so on. It's a really nice way of thinking. Thank you. Okay, well, this is a question that we also asked the previous panel. I would like to hear your responses. There may be folks in this room who had a negative experience with literature, or just felt there was no time in their lives for literature. What would you say to them?
Well, I would lure them into playing a writing game with me. So, because I feel it's true, we all have such busy lives. But as the previous panel highlighted already, there are so many important moments in which we need meaning making. And that has to do with reading and literature, and with reading it, but also, as it was pointed out previously, hearing it or speaking it or creating it together. So this is where I'll pass the mic.
Yeah, and I just want to intervene here. There's this concept of clock time that Bergson came up with, this idea that you're driven by your schedule, as opposed to kind of what he called the durée, this sort of psychological time which goes forwards and backwards. And it's a matter of trying to escape clock time, right? Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't resist. In one of my papers, I pick up on Dewey's notion of qualitative time, his radical empiricism, and serial time. And my example is time in the arms of your lover versus your times at a dole committee meeting. If you, okay, y'all got it. those are two very different temporalities. I have the perfect literacy story, as it turns out. My parents' education in both their cases stopped at the end of the 6th grade. But my mother read to me, okay, comic books and such. And so this is it. There weren't a lot of books in the house because there wasn't always electricity in the house, okay? But right from the get-go, there were books present. I've read a lot of Perry Mason and a lot of Zane Grey when I got old enough to read it. And the National Enquirer was in the house. Both my parents were quite skeptical of the document, but they thought it amusing. And so I can remember, getting to the National Enquirer early. Get off of the notion of ennobling literature, right? Or get away from edifying. This book is going to edify you. Are you sure about that? And maybe I don't want to be edified today. Maybe I just want to enjoy reading. So whatever it is, Zane Grey or Perry Mason back in the day, whatever the contemporary equivalent of that, or whatever you're finding out there on Twitter that's doing Dixonian sounding installments on daily installments on Twitter or something. If that's where you're getting off, then first of all, get off. Just enjoy reading, and take delight in it. Once you have the habit, and because of the tradition I work in, I do mean embodied habit. One of my degrees is neurophysiological, psychology. So there are synapses involved here, but I'm not a reductivist. There's a lot more involved here. Once you catch the habit, try some other stuff. But as we all know, when we were going to read the book that was going to be edifying for us and it bored us, you don't really remember anything except being bored by that book. But once you acquire the habit, then branch out. But certainly, if you start something and you don't like it, as Emily Dickinson would say, it followed me in darkness, so I shunned it. Well, shun it. It deserves, and let it ennoble somebody else. And instead of worrying about what's wrong with you, worry about the sheer enjoyment and pleasure in the reading. My guess is once you get the habit, then it's got you, and you'll start reading all kinds of stuff. Oh.
Well, no, but I do appreciate being passed the baton, both literally and metaphorically, absolutely. I think just continuing exactly what you were saying, I think move away from the notion that literature ought to look like any one particular thing, and that I think Ikeda shows us that poetry is everywhere. It's all around us. And one of my favorite installments or installations of art is in Poetry in Motion on the New York City subway. And they're short poems that are just put up where the billboards would be put up. And this is a form of engaging literature in your daily life. And I think that music is some of the best literature and poetry in the world. And so I'd encourage students to listen to music and read their song lyrics and spend time with their lyric books, if there are lyric books, or spend time looking at the lyrics and thinking about them. A lot of my students talk to me about how they're discovering literature while they're doing dishes through audiobooks. I have a lot of returning students who have children, and as they're cooking dinner and as they clean up at night, or as they're on their commutes, they listen to audiobooks, and it's a form of real pleasure for them. I also just recently, my class is reading The Tempest. I told them to get on YouTube and read aloud with YouTube while there was a rendition in action of the play, and to turn it into a conversation with YouTube. So I think we just need to decide that literature looks a lot of different ways, and it's not one set of experiences. And I mean, I think there is something to be said for having, the Wolf Scholar here, proverbial room of one's own, so that you can have silence and space to think. But sometimes that creates a barrier of entry, and we should be knocking down those barriers.
Yeah, thank you so much. These are really mind-opening comments. And I just wanted to add, because Jim mentions Emily Dickinson, one of the best-known sort of proto-modern poets in the U.S. actually, she only published about 3 or 4 poems during her lifetime, and in fact made sure that she preserved all the poetry she wrote. And when people first saw the poems and they were printed, none of the publishers liked the dashes. They thought that it was what women did when they were writing recipes. So it's kind of an amazing situation here. But I thought that what we could continue with is this question of the definition of literature, this issue of how you would define literature, because Dickinson's poetry was not defined as literature when she wrote it. Are there good or bad works of literature, or literature that creates more value than others? And how does Ikeda define literature in your view? Yeah, Giulia.
I'll enjoy sitting right next to Anita. Yes, first part of my academic training was in the Italian context, where there's a strong tradition of defining what is art and what isn't. Maybe because of that, I strongly resist these boundaries, and actually both the writers that I focused on for my PhD strongly opposed this as a stronghold for an elitist conception of literature. So their goal was instead to write what everyone would have dreamed of writing themselves. And looking at Ikeda's approach to this, I was rereading his university addresses towards today, so from the book A New Humanism. And it's interesting to observe, how Ikeda shares he was inspired in his own quest for peace and cultural creativity, as it was shared previously. But then, two, that I want to quote it right. So he wrote in a university address shared in Bucharest in 1983. So truly great literature must have a universal appeal and the ability to portray the hearts and minds of people in fine, sensitive strokes. And another point that he adds in another lecture is that great works of literature bring us to transcend national and linguistic boundaries and become the treasure for all people. So thinking of literature being a treasure for all people, he often praises literary traditions that are concerned with people's lives, feelings, sufferings, societal contradictions, because that is how literature becomes a treasure of all people. So I'm excited to read more in this sense, because I feel this is just the beginning or the surface.
I'm tempted to quickly pass the baton. When we were chatting together at lunch last night, I mentioned that I have degrees in 4 rather distinct areas, but the only C I ever got in college was in English. So you can see the situation I'm in here. So I want to tear right into giving you the true definition of literature and save us a lot of time that way. Definitions. I mean, someone in the first panel pointed out, definitions that are the cookie cutters are dangerous because the exception will arise. What do you do with found poems? What do you do with young adult literature, which I'm particularly fond of? What do you do with graphic novels? They cheat, right? A picture's worth 1,000 words, so they can press all of that, stuff in there. In a minute, I'll defend that definitional task, but if I was going to go with something, the philosopher in me certainly is familiar with Wittgenstein, who has a sort of the family resemblance notion that could be of some use to you. There, you can maybe come up with a few paradigms and worry about what's out there at the margin. Definitional poems are everywhere. I have a very strong background in the sciences, and in fact took my present job in education from an NSF grant, mathematical logic, where things get defined very precisely. Right, for those of you that know Zumelo Frankl set theory, there's the axiom of separation. It nails this stuff. But of course, the price of precision is content, and that can be one of the dangers and the traps and the traps of it. I'll actually take a bit of a crack at what might define good literature, as long as you keep that in a small g and put quotes around it. But there is literature that has, as a karmic seed, flowered again and again, generation after generation and generation. And not because some people are trying to defend a canon or some such, but because people find it. And I mean, the Epic of Gilgamesh is, like 2,500 years old or something like that. And, as a son of a career Marine, an ex-Marine myself with a certain disposition, the account of a warrior that got over it in a certain sense, spoke to me in ways it might not speak to other people. But I think it has spoken to people across generations. So there is something to be said for literature that people find things in generation after generation after generation back, literally thousands of years. But the good literature thing is tricky. I think when we were chatting, earlier, lunch last night, at dinner last night or another time, I was introduced to young adult literature, and it walloped me because basically we go through that period in our lives, and a lot of those wounds scab over, but they never healed. And when the scabs came off, it still stung, and I got there in my mid-30s. But he gave all of it to me, so he gave me Smart Girl to read. Now, Smart Girl is subtitled, if she's so smart, why did she get a D in dating? And she figures it out. Don't talk smart around boys, redo your look, and have an experience as a male I'd never had. And it was actually, oddly enough, a good book for me, although I'm not so sure it was a great book for Smart Girl. Okay, that I'll leave up to you. And so I think that gives a certain contextuality, both in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, and things like that, age, and other things. And it allows any book to potentially be, on an occasion and in a certain situation, a good book. And bless him, by the way, for teaching that along with other early young adult literature novels. That also whacked me.
I think there are so many things that are completely interconnected that it's hard to parse out some of these definitional categories, like literature and poetry and dialogue. I think that they're very much enmeshed in each other. So I come from a deconstructive school of thought that would posit in some formulations that literature is an ethical invitation. This is one of the things that I talk with my students about, is that the text, if you define ethics as the response to the call of the other, so ethics isn't necessarily the way you respond, although some ways might be arguably more ethical than others, but it is the event of response, that you are called metaphysically to certain things and that you will respond, and that is what ethics is. Then the text is calling to the other in its being to engage a response, and it's therefore inviting a dialogue. And so in that way, and Levinas says that all research is posed as a question. All academic research has a question mark behind it, and therefore all research is a conversation. So in some ways, we could think of literature as a dialogue. We can think of literature as an ethical call, as an ethic. And I think that, there's also invitation to think of literature in this dialogue as a form of poetry, where if poetry is the relationship, as Ikeda presents it, between the inner world and the outer world, that literature engages these, what the quote he has is, resonant harmonies that arise between the vast outer cosmos and the inner human cosmos. So I think that what's important for me about thinking about literature is its porousness, and how it does resist certain definitions, is there good literature and bad literature? I did watch a philosophy professor unpack a Dasani water bottle in front of me and subvert all notions of natural. So I'm not going to say that there is good and bad literature. Also, I'm indebted to a scholar who made her career undermining the notion of bad literature because she often and rightfully read that bad coded as what was written out of the canon. And so she burst open those exclusionary measures and in all of our classes did what she called textual pairings, high canonical literature against what was unread at the time. So I think that I have a real investment in subverting the notion of bad literature and seeing these conversations as kind of bleeding into the others. But I think also that poetry, I said it before, but I want to come back to this quote because I think it's so beautiful. The poetic spirit can be found in any human endeavor, writes Ikeda. So literature, I think poetry is everywhere. It's in all the things. And it, quote, has the power to retune and reconnect a discordant, divided world. And so I think there's something regenerative and healing, and it's part of a foundational peacemaking process, and that's part of its interconnection too.
Can't believe it. I actually passed the baton, and I didn't mean to do it. I want to just, as I pass the baton back down this way, in the end, we're going to make decisions about incommensurable values. We're going to do it on the rough ground, because for those of us that have taught, what do you leave in and what do you leave out? You will make a decision about what books you will order for your course or what books you will assign for them, for them to read. Now, there's many purposes that are going on, in that. But in the end, we do, all of us, make value decisions. I know a lot of curriculum theorists. I know Jane knows a lot of curriculum theorists. And so, what do you put in on the racetrack? What do you leave out? And so we all make those decisions. Those are fear and trembling decisions because there's no transcendent or transcendental criteria that are going to make those decisions for you. What was Derrida's term when you go through, he has a nice term for what I would call making incommensurable decisions. I can't remember it right now, so I'll hand you the mic, and that way I don't have to remember anything.
Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you so much. I know we could listen to them forever, but we are on clock time. So we have maybe time for 2 questions now before we move on to our next agenda item. So again, if anyone has any questions, me and Jay can run the mic over to you. So anybody from the audience? Roy, okay.
I wonder if any of you could comment on a play that was kind of, I guess you could say, an early anti-war play, literature that really resulted in bringing about peace. And what I'm thinking of in particular is if you could comment on the play Lysistrata.
You mean as a male, you want me to jump on that question?
If you don't mind my asking, why is your question about this specific work? Is it a work that means something for you, or is it a work that you encountered at some point? Is it, I'd be curious to hear.
Because I think the conversation has been, very enlightening, and I appreciate it. But I'm thinking if at least I would appreciate hearing something that's a little more specific And I think that this is a play, that this is a literature that dealt with this concept. And I believe the protagonist is a great example for all of us. And so I was thinking of that, and I was also thinking of perhaps some of the lyrics of some of the songs that really affected a change in the Vietnam War, that really led the country to do something different. There were some songs, there was poetry in that, and there were people. So I guess in conclusion, I'm just trying to make it a little bit specific.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll pick it up. I mean, it's a play at a time the Greek society is falling apart over warfare and will eventually rather consume itself. Browning, I think it's a line in Browning. Art that no way speaks to man but mankind. Art shall do the deed and breed the thought. I love that reverse direction. And so in an anti-war play like that, or in many of the protest songs, during the Vietnam War, art is trying to do the deed to breed the thought. When Shelley says that the poets are the ultimate legislatures, he's right. Sooner or later, what will become, our common parlance of, were the poet's metaphor and trope and, metonymy and simile and such. These are turnings, right, in the deep etymological sense of trope, and they do practical work in their time on the ground. I'm embarrassed that I can't remember the tragedian that wrote the Life of Strada. Aristophanes, perfect. My kind of guy. I'm thinking of Socrates, born aloft on the flatus of philosophy at the moment, but a different play, the Clouds. But it's social. It's social critique in a way that's not so easily avoided. Again, it's the expression versus the propositional. It's expressive in its critique. I certainly remember the time my youth is defined, around that. My early, manhood is defined around the songs of Vietnam that are doing the deed and trying to do the thought. Let's approach it from the other end. I'm not getting down to where you want to get, but there's something that tyrants know about the arts in general and literature in particular that Democrats don't. They immediately censor it, and then they create a lot of bad, flat, one-dimensional, supposedly realistic art. Again, Shelley's right. The artists are the ultimate legislatures. But no, I can't give you a detailed reading of Lysistrata as an anti-war text, other than to praise anti-war text and such. If you care to say more, I'd be willing to hear it also.
Okay, it's been 20 years with me and Lysistrata, and I don't know that I can speak directly. And also, I am unfamiliar with the Vietnam version. The version that I know is the translation from the Greek, and I read it as an undergraduate and didn't reapproach it. So I'm going to try and pull some threads. And might I ask, would it be grounding and helpful to talk about Antigone? Because that one I can talk about in concrete terms. Because Virginia Woolf talks about looking back to the ancient Greeks. And she does read Lysistrata, but it's been so long since I've read Lysistrata that I can't reconstruct that. But one of the things that is an important thread, I think, in both Lysistrata and Antigone is the convergence of feminism and pacifism. And there is a relationship of women's communities and women's cultures to thinking peace. And Virginia Woolf opens Three Guineas, which is her feminist, pacifist, socialist manifesto, written in 1938 during the Spanish Civil War. She opens Three Guineas with a response. So it's a question that's being asked of her from a man in a male society for peace. And the question is, Madame, how may we prevent war? And she says, this is an amazing question. This may be the first time in history that an educated man writes to the daughter of an educated man asking, how are we to prevent peace? And then in Three Guineas, she looks back to the cycles of history and the ancient Greeks. And she talks about how women might actually have some insights into peacemaking, not because biologically we're somehow more peaceful. And in fact, Woolf actually very deliberately says that if we're threatened, we're as ferocious as anyone else, and if our children are threatened, we're really ferocious. So it's not biology or this kind of naturality or kind of woo, feminine spirit or anything that will allow us to have insights into peace. It's the fact that we've been educated in two different modes. And because our education has been different, she says, and this is paraphrasing, and I'm going to go in and out of some of her language, because our education has been different, our minds have become different. And so we have different orientations to the world. And for Woolf, these different orientations to the world that have been bred in women's societies means that collectively, maybe women can think peace. And what we have in Lysistrata, from my understanding and my recollection of an undergraduate, and I'm so sorry, is that we have a woman's collective here thinking peace, right, in this line. Now, Woolf reads Antigone very specifically in Three Guineas, as does Judith Butler in Antigone's Claim. And Antigone becomes, if Lysistrata is the commune of women or the collective of women singing peace, then Antigone is the feminist fighter who is challenging the patriarch and challenging the tyrant. And in that way, Antigone is doing peacemaking work by insisting on burying her brother, by acknowledging his humanity, by undermining the logic of enmity, by not recognizing her brother as the enemy and saying, no, he really is a spirit. And so she becomes, in Three Guineas, a symbol for the cry throughout time. Antigone's cry in the cave is the cry of women for this cry of peace. And Woolf has this magnificent phrase in passage, a couple of passages in the last couple of pages of Three Guineas, where she talks about how the same dead bodies and ruined houses have haunted us for the last 2,000 years, and how history repeats itself, it may seem, and how the cry of Antigone from the cave is still the cry that we're making today, and that Creon's dictatorship has indeed come back in the form of Mussolini, Hitler, but also in the British male patriarchy. And she's writing as an English woman in 1938. It's come back in the guise of Francisco Franco, and that behind the dead bodies and ruined houses, we can see the images of the tyrants and the dictators, and that this is what Antigone challenges. So I don't know if that's enough grounding, and I tried my very best to get back to ancient Greek, but I'm really rusty on, and now I have to go read it. I'm reading it on the plane. That's it.
Just let me say real quick, of course, that the anthem of the time was "Make love, not war." And of course, what's great about Antigone is it's the women saying, if you want to make love, stop making war. Yeah.
So I think with all of that, actually concludes our Q&A portion. Can we give a final round of applause to our wonderful panelists? And also, can we also give a round of applause to Anita for being such a wonderful moderator? So I'm sure at this point you're all really eager to have your own dialogues of the heart, but we've also been sitting for a long time, and so we're going to take a quick break and do actually a really fun movement activity that's going to be led by our very own Giulia. If you didn't know, Giulia is a master of fun and movement and activity, so you're really in for a treat. And I think we have time after the movement activity to get some cookies. If you don't feel comfortable participating in the movement activity, that's okay as well. But at this time, I will turn it over to Giulia, if that's okay.
Hello. I'll find some room here. So I have a question for you first. Yes. So were you aware that there is someone who is always accompanying you in whatever you do, and specifically someone who personally sustains you as you do your things, collects information for you, and waits most of the times very patiently for you to acknowledge them? Do you know who this someone is? Oh, everyone knows. Yes, it's our body. So it took care of us as we were sleeping last night. It accompanied us in our morning errands or commitments. It literally took us to the Ikeda Center today. And it has been sitting for the past 2.5 hours. What a dedication. So how about including our bodies in the flourishing of Dialogues of the Heart we're having today? So I invite you to stand up, as some of you very enthusiastically did, and enjoy a nice stretch. Yes, beautiful. So if you feel like you can acknowledge the wonder that our body is by tapping a little bit, magic is happening all over. We're breathing, we're turning food into energy. Maybe if you feel stiff, you can move a little bit. Yes, and now to go back into 3D, I invite you to make a small 8-shaped movement with your head. Please don't get dizzy. Don't get dizzy. Just for starting to move a little bit. And whenever you feel ready, imagine there's 2 pencils on your shoulders, drawing 8 shape. Oh, yes. I can see you moving. Yes, okay. So maybe after all these words, it's going to be awkward to communicate beyond words, but isn't it true that we have not those many opportunities to use our body to express, communicate, or even learn? So this is what we will do. We will come up with a movement. This movement will encapsulate something that we felt today at the Ikeda Forum, something that we learned or something that we got. Then we will walk around in the room, find a partner. We will do our move. They'll do our move with us. Then they'll do their move. We'll do their move with them. And after that, we can share why we did that movement or how it felt to do the other person's movement. So first of all, let's find our move. Okay, focus. We can close our eyes if we want. We can maybe picture something in the eye of our mind, or maybe we feel like doing something. We don't need to understand it. We just need to trust the wisdom of our body. And I hope you have one already, but in case you need some inspiration, I'll volunteer Valentina and I to model this activity for you. Hi. So, very spontaneously. So, who goes first? Mm-hmm. Okay, and thank you. Okay, thank you. With your move, I felt like I was somehow in dialogue with everyone in the room.
Oh, nice. For me, it was like, oh, a book, a world of wonders. And this is the feeling I got from hearing you all.
Thank you so much. So I hope you'll have a lot of fun. Maybe we have time for 1 or 2 iterations. We'll see. So I hope you'll enjoy.
So welcome back to most of you. I hope you got some cookies, and I saw some very complicated moves earlier, like up in the air, and I was very impressed. So thank you, Giulia and Valentina, for leading us in that wonderful movement activity. So as I shared earlier, I'd like to introduce a very special musical performance by a very special artist who is another dear friend of the Ikeda Center. Her name is Goulah, also known as Heiraza. And we've had the great fortune of knowing her since she was an Ikeda Center Youth Committee member. Many of you may know her as well. And coincidentally, in 2019, she participated in a dialogue project and organized by the center, and her dialogue partner at that time was Anita. So it's really special for us that the both of them are in this year's forum. So a little bit about Heiraza. After moving here from Turkey, she studied at Berklee College of Music, followed by receiving her master's degree from the New England Conservatory. She has toured the US and performed on stages like Hatch Memorial Shell, WBUR City Space, and Shaolin Liu Performance Center as a multi-award winning vocalist. In June 2022, she released her first single from her debut album, Inherited, which she will be sharing more with us today. And her bio is also in our program, so you can learn more about her work there. But with that, let's welcome to the stage Heiraza.
Thank you, Lillian, and thank you so much for Ikeda Center, not only for having me, but also all the experience I had here really made me decide to steer my life's work towards the direction of peace-building dialogue. So this is like a very, very important stage for me to be on. So, and thank you all for being here. And a little bit about the songs I want to mention before I start singing. So my dad is a retired engineer, but he has songs, like he always wanted to be a musician, a singer-songwriter, and he has songs from his youth, from the 70s, like over 400 songs. And before I came here, he made a book out of them and gave the books to me. This is like 2010. And he said, like, you know, these songs are yours. And I didn't really open the books for 8 years or so. And then I started to go through all these lyrics and music. And the more I read, more I developed a newfound, like, I started to get to know my dad in a very, different, perspective. And when he was writing these songs, he was in his early 20s. So I was also having a lot of like difficult time back then when I was reading. So I decided to rewrite some of the lyrics to his songs and in the form of letters to him, and talking about my immigration and mental health and everything that I processed here. So also you'll hear a little bit of his voice too from the only album that he made, but never released. So the only copy is sitting in the drawer of the house that I grew up in. So you'll hear a little bit of that too. So thank you so much.
regret, sadness, and fear. It's easy to recall all the fear that sprouts within the life, takes over after some time in life. Could you make me a paper plane from your fears, fold them something brave, and throw it, let it soar in the sky towards the Atlantic and landing over here, or else it crawls into my throat and I'll wear it after you are done with it. Skin, hair, beating hearts, covered under old threads of thought. Truth never bends like human heart in the face of all doubt. Bright and true, child of earth, which one would you choose to pass down? Cautious, fast, and mostly incorrect, or wise, purposeful, but falsely blamed? Divided bodies from minds, wandering in the fields and lands, reaping the abundant crops of pointed fingers, watered and blamed. But for that first I'll reunite with my own body. We all forgot. Truth never bends like human heart in the face of all doubt. Truth never bends like human heart in the face of all doubt. Oh,
to conclude our forum today, we actually wanted to invite all of our panelists to share with us what they are excited to turn to next in their own literary adventures and journeys. So, you probably received one of these when you came in. We realized we didn't really explain them. They're bookmarks, but they're also library cards. So on the back, you can write a book that you want to read, the date, the rating, though I think maybe, I don't know if our panelists would approve the rating of the books after today's conversation, but you can. So as they share their what they're looking forward to reading next, maybe we can write them on our library cards, or you can write your own as well. So maybe, Anita, I'll turn it over to you, and then we can pass it down.
Sure. I would like to read a book called Dreamer, a novel by Charles Johnson, who's a Black American National Book Award winning novelist who's a Buddhist practitioner who's also written about SGI. And this Dreamer is about the last 2 years of Martin Luther King's life. Yeah.
Well, okay, and for the sake of honesty, the next thing I'm going to be reading that's off the shelf and ready to go is Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception, which is if you know what it is, he takes mescaline and describes his experiences, which will send me back to read, of course, William Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, in which William Blake says if the doors of perception were cleansed, things would appear as it is to man, infinite. I wish I was reading something a little more wholesome, but that's really what I want to read next, so there it is.
I recently treated myself to a book that many people have been talking about, and so far it is a delight, so I've already turned to it, but I'm going to continue turning to it. And it's called The Language of Trees, and it's an anthology by Kay Holton. And so it is, so far it is just a delight. So I invite you all to have those conversations with trees.
I asked Ken what Whitman work he would recommend in the current moment. He said Song of Myself, so I'm definitely going to reread that. And I'm torn, quite frankly. I haven't been reading literature because of my work. I sort of have moved away from it. For me, there's José Saramago and then everybody else. So I think I'll go back to him for something. And then I also want to reread War and Peace to get a kind of Tolstovian sort of a perspective on the current moment.
Sarah's comment reminds me, I've been meaning to read the Overstory, so I have to get to that. But another book that's on my mind is The Quarry. It was a novel Charles Chestnut wrote that wasn't published in his lifetime, and it raises questions: was it not published because it wasn't good enough, or was it not published because he was not understood in his own time? So some of the canon questions we were considering.
I'm looking forward to revisiting Roberto Bolaño's 2666. I'm teaching a myth and symbol course, and so it's an epic narrative historical fiction, and I'm very excited about it. I'm also looking forward to revisiting Charles R. Johnson's Middle Passage.
I'm teaching a Virginia Woolf and Conversation course next semester, and so I'm currently reading Goulah right now as a companion to Mrs. Dalloway, and then I look forward to reading Days of Afriquite by Asali Solomon, and that's inspired by both Mrs. Dalloway and Goulah, so it's bringing the two of them together.
I regret I don't have my pen right now, but I'll come back to ask. From my part, what I was inspired to do again by this discussion is to really read with an open heart and without a clock. And what I want to go back to is Daisaku Ikeda's poems, Journey of Life, that I turned to more technically until now, really to understand, but now I want to have a dialogue of the heart with those works. Yeah.
So can we give a final round of applause to our wonderful panelists? And don't worry, Giulia, our wonderful publications associate Mitch, who is right here, writes wonderful write-ups from all of our forums, so I'm sure he will capture the list from tonight so everybody can receive it as well. And in the beginning, when Kevin shared Mr. Ikeda's message, where he said an open dialogue with an open heart is the very wellspring of peace, I really felt that so much in the room tonight. So I want to thank our panelists and thank all of you for really making that come to life today. With that, please enjoy a wonderful rest of your Saturday afternoon, and thank you once again for coming out to celebrate with us.